Welcome to the Reading for the Glory podcast. I'm your host, Zach Kendrick, editor of Reading for the Glory. Reading for the Glory exists to help followers of Jesus think biblically about books. For more information, please visit readingfortheglory.com.
This episode is brought to you in part by Crossway. Crossway is a not-for-profit Christian ministry that exists solely for the purpose of proclaiming the gospel through publishing. At Crossway, you will find resources on theology, biblical studies, discipleship, children's books, history and biographies, the ESV Bible, and more. Enjoy 30% off your next purchase with a Crossway Plus membership. This program is designed to provide you with gospel-centered resources aimed at strengthening your faith and serving the church. When you sign up for a free Crossway Plus account, you will enjoy 30% off your purchase. Members also receive 40% off bulk purchases, 50% off all ebooks and audiobooks, as well as free shipping on orders of $30 or more, making it more convenient and affordable than ever to purchase directly from Crossway. Sign up for your free Crossway Plus membership at crossway.org/30 or click the link in today's show notes. Today on the podcast, I am delighted to be joined by Lucy S.R. Austen. Lucy is a writer, editor, and teacher who has spent over a decade studying source materials on Elizabeth Elliot. She has served on the editorial staff of the Spring Hill Review, contributed to various publications, and developed 2 high school English textbooks on prominent Christian authors. Lucy lives in the Pacific Northwest with her husband and her children, and she is the author of Elisabeth Elliot, A Life, published by Crossway in 2023. So welcome to the Reading for the Glory podcast, Lucy.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, glad to have you. In our conversation today, we're going to be discussing Lucy's new book, Elisabeth Elliot, A Life. In fact, Reading for the Glory named Lucy's book the best biography of 2023 in our Best Books of 2023 series. So we're excited to talk about that book today. But before we do that, we like to ask all of our guests, specifically first-time guests on our podcast, a few icebreaker questions to get to know them a little bit better, and so our audience can get to know our guests a little bit better. So are you good with that?
Sounds good.
All righty. Yeah, you give it just one to 2 word answers, maybe up to a sentence, depending on how much you want to go into. So where did you grow up?
Lived in the Pacific Northwest most of my life. So on the western side of the mountains in the rain shadow.
There you go. What is your favorite color?
Oh, that's a good question. My kids would tell you it's white. Our whole house is painted white. So.
All right. That's the first one. Most people say red, blue, or green, or something like that, but white. That's okay. A good one. What's your favorite food?
Oh, it's really hard to pick a favorite, but I think maybe pierogies.
Oh, the Polish.
Yeah. Little potato-filled fried goodness.
Yeah. I've never had one, but it sounds delightful. I've seen it on like Food Network and that sort of thing. I need to try one.
Yeah, they're great.
What is your favorite sport to watch?
My favorite sport to watch? Oh, that's a great question. It's probably football. All my brothers played football.
Okay.
I learned to like it watching them play. So
there you go. Football is a great sport. I think most of Americans would say that was probably their favorite sport too, or baseball too. Anyway. What is your favorite hobby?
It's reading. I know that's kind of boring on a reading podcast, but that's it.
That would probably be most of our listeners' favorite hobby, or at least one of them, hopefully, coming on the Reading for the Glory podcast. So that's good. What is your favorite book that you've written? I know this is the most recent one and probably the most well-known one, but I know you've written several others. So
yeah, I think this is probably my favorite. I definitely have spent the most of my life working on it, so it's been a part of my life for a long time now. So,
and we're going to assume that the Bible is this is our last question in this round. But what is your favorite book besides the Bible?
Oh, that's that's another hard one. There are so many good books. Maybe today I'll say Death Comes for the Archbishop by Willa Cather.
All right. I don't think I've ever heard of that book, so I'll
I
have to check
highly
that one out.
recommend it. Yeah,
All
it's
right.
a good one.
All right. Well, that ends our kind of get to know you round of our conversation. So thank you for those. But before we jump into our conversation today, I wanted to take a moment and remind our listeners that this episode is brought to you in part by Crossway. Listeners can enjoy 30% off Lucy's new book by being a Crossway Plus member. And for more information, you can visit crossway.org/30, or you can check out the link in today's show notes. And so, thinking about the topic of your book, the life and ministry and legacy, even of Elisabeth Elliot, I wanted to begin. We like to begin a lot of our podcasts as much as we can, and we usually are able to incorporate this into our conversations to help set up the topic. And I want to read from Luke chapter 14, verses 21 to 23. And the slave came back and reported to his master. This is the parable of the dinner, where he tells him to go and get the guests to come in to the dinner. And so the slave comes into the master and says, reported back that the people don't want to come in. And so the head of the household becomes angry, and he says, go out into the streets, into the lanes of the city, and bring in the poor and the crippled, the blind and the lame. And the slave said to the master, Master, what you commanded has been done, and still there is room. And the master said to the slave, go out into the highways and along the hedges and compel them to come in, so that my house may be filled. And when I think about the life of Elisabeth Elliot, I think about her mission work and her going and sharing the gospel, not just as a missionary, but also as a professor and speaker and writer. As we begin our conversation, for our listeners who may not be familiar with the life of Elisabeth Elliot, can you share with us kind of a short synopsis? I know that's the point of the book, but a short synopsis of who Elisabeth Elliot was and why her life is worth reading about.
Yes. So Elisabeth Elliot was one of many young adults who pursued a career as a foreign missionary in the surge in missions interest that followed World War II. And she became internationally known in 1956 when her husband Jim and four of their closest friends were killed in an attempt to make missionary contact with the Wairani, an indigenous people group in rural Ecuador. So that story, which was kind of framed in the news as a sort of modern pioneer story of missionaries with guns and airplanes who were killed by unknown warriors with hardwood spears, really captured public interest. And so then 2 years later, the public was kind of shocked again by the news that Elliot had gone and was living with the people who had killed her husband and working to try to translate the Bible into their language. And Elliot wrote a book about that initial contact attempt, which became kind of an instant and then a very long-running bestseller. And then subsequently wrote another book describing her life among the Wairani. So that's kind of how she became publicly known. And when she left Ecuador in 1963 to pursue full-time work as a writer, public interest in her story was still very high. She was receiving 2 or 3 speaking invitations every day. And as, yeah, and as time went on, so she increasingly became known as not just part of that well-known missionary story, but also as a Christian thinker and teacher on a range of topics. So for the next 40 years, she traveled nationally and internationally and spoke. She published 26 more books, which were translated into more than a dozen languages. She had a bi-monthly newsletter for 20 years and a 5-day-a-week radio program for more than a decade. And so even though she died in 2015 at the age of 88, her work is still being read and shared, particularly through the internet. And so still a cultural influence today.
Yeah, very, very much so. And I know she is seen as an influence among younger Christians who seek to be missionaries, and use not just the story of her husband and the other four men who were killed, but also her story as influence in her own life and encouragement to go on the mission field. Um, and so I'm thankful that you wrote a biography of her. I know it's not the only biography of hers, especially even in recent years. I think another 2-volume biography has come out from another publisher on Elisabeth Elliot. Um, a biography of this magnitude is not something that a biographer just decides to write on a whim. And I think you mentioned earlier that it's taken the better part of your life. How long is it? How long did it take you to work on this project?
So I officially started the project in the summer of 2012. So, and then it came out in the summer of 2023. So 11 years from kind of launching the project to the book going into readers' hands. So.
Yeah, have you seen it? It's been out a few months, and we're not the first podcast you've been on to discuss your book. Has it been well received since it's been released?
It seems to have been. I am no expert in the book selling side of the industry, but everybody, there's been an overwhelmingly positive response from people I've talked to about it, which has been wonderful. So.
Yeah, I know you, and it's been mentioned in, like Christianity Today and the Gospel Coalition and other outlets such as that. So, very high praise for your book. Um, so you mentioned just a minute ago that Elisabeth Elliot passed away in 2015. Um, and in the book, you mentioned that you were able to go and visit her before she passed away. What was that experience like in interacting with her and her family in preparation for this project?
Well, I was able to spend some time with her and her husband in their home in the fall of 2014. So it was just a few months really before she
Mm,
went home to be with the Lord. So, and of course, by then she had been in dementia for um, almost 15 years. So she wasn't able to communicate much with me.
mm,
And I struggle with shyness on meeting new people. So we didn't talk very much, but um, it
mm,
was. Um, it was wonderful to be able to be in her home and see the home that she had designed and decorated, and spend time there and get to meet her and um, so on. So yeah,
yeah,
it was special.
I can imagine how if she wasn't struggling with dementia and not just a few months away from her own passing, I'm sure she would have been a very gracious and kind host as well. I'm sure she still was, but probably more so in that. Was there one thing in particular, or maybe a couple things that compelled you to write this biography of Elisabeth Elliot?
Yeah. So before I started this project, I knew that Elliot had been a missionary in Ecuador, and I knew that she was a writer. I probably knew her more as a writer, actually. So I had read her novel No Graven Image, which I also recommend to everybody, and I knew I wanted to include that novel in a textbook that I was working on as one of the readings for the students. Um, but when I tried to find biographies of Elliot so that I could learn more about her to write the mini biography that would be part of the textbook, um, I was really startled to find, really taken aback to find that there wasn't a full length biography of her in existence. There was
Mm,
one that was written for children, which mostly covered her time in Ecuador, but there was nothing that focused on her whole life. So, and she was such a well known figure that I was really surprised to find that. But I ended up
yeah.
having to go directly to source material to write about her. So her own writing, autobiographical writing about her life, and contacting some family members to talk to them. And I was really intrigued by everything that I found. She didn't fit very neatly into any of the sort of pre-existing boxes in my mind. Um, and the more that I dug into her life, the more I realized that she's been widely known but not deeply known. Um, her involvement in the effort to contact the Waorani is known because of Through Gates of Splendor and the movie End of the Spear, I think that you mentioned. Um, her role as a writer and speaker in 20th century American evangelicalism is familiar to a lot of people, but the rest of her story kind of has been unknown or unavailable. And so tackling this project grew out of that combination of my own growing interest in her life and knowing that there was this gap in the record.
Yeah, I think it's interesting how you say that she was widely known but not deeply known. And as I mentioned earlier, I think there's another 2-volume biography that just came out. I forget the publisher. I don't know if it's B&H or
B&H.
Zondervan.
Yeah.
B&H. Okay, but your book was the first one. I believe that it was published before those came out, or almost kind of at the same time. But what was it like interacting with? Because you mentioned you couldn't go to any other source besides her own, the first primary source, her own first person notes and writings and journals and that sort of thing. What was it like interacting with that material in preparation for the book?
It was really interesting. It was I felt like she has she has a very distinctive published writing voice, but she also had a very distinctive personal voice in her more private writing, her family letters and her journals. And so I felt like I got a really strong sense of her as a person from reading the material that she left behind. And that was just a neat process.
Yeah, was it an overwhelming process at times, being the first one going through that, or did you just find it enjoyable and just good the whole time?
It could be overwhelming in the sense that there was so much material. And
Mm,
especially once I was under contract for the book and, I was kind of writing against the clock. So
mm.
there could be that kind of sense of time pressure. But, for the most part, it was just a fascinating process. And, I loved the research involved.
As we kind of dive into the book a little bit more and her life a little bit more, it comes across in the book that she could be quite feisty and strong-willed. Um, and I think that comes through even in her own writings too. But
Yeah.
do you think that her temperament was an asset or a hindrance throughout her life? Maybe both. What do you think?
I think that you're right that it was both. So her strength and her zeal helped sustain her in crises and also just in the long hard slog of every day. The things that aren't always visible to other people but are still difficult to live through. Um, but those same attributes also sometimes seem like they contributed to getting her into difficult places in the first place. So, um,
Yeah.
but I think that's the case for everybody. Every character trait is like a coin with two sides, and it gives us particular strengths and also makes us liable to certain weaknesses. So,
Yeah, I think her feistiness and even strong-willed tendencies are what helped lend to her going back into the jungle to interact with the Wildani. I think it'd be very difficult. I can't even imagine facing someone who killed my own spouse, in America. But in that situation where the cultures are so different, the language is so different. Um, and you don't know if you yourself are going to be harmed or killed. I think that personality trait served her well in that experience. So yeah, I think I would agree with that as well. Also in the book you share, and I think this is probably coupled with her feistiness and strong-willed tendencies, but that she wasn't afraid of hard work, even sometimes to the point of overstretching herself. What can we learn from her example through her work ethic, not just in our own jobs, but in our Christian life and in how we serve the Lord.
It's helpful to me to think about, in regard to that question, to differentiate between different kinds of being overstretched. So I think we can be overstretched by things that can legitimately be let go or delegated. I think we can be overstretched by things where it would be wrong to back out. A nice clear-cut example is, getting up to feed the new baby in the middle of the night. A lot of the things that choices we're faced with aren't that clear-cut, and it takes some more discernment, and it's going to look different for different people at different times. But thinking about Elliot's example, I mean, I think we can follow her example in keeping going during those times when being overstretched came from circumstances outside her control. Her kind of famous motto was, "Do the next thing." Just put one foot in front of the other and do the next duty that comes to hand. But at the same time, I think we can be aware that because of cultural influences, theological influences, personality traits, she may not always have made the right call about her workload. And we don't necessarily have to be as busy as she was in order to be doing the right thing. So
I think that's helpful, and I think and I think you touched on that a little bit there. That we all don't have the same plate or size plate.
yeah.
Some people can handle more than others can, and so I think it's helpful to know ourselves, know our limitations, and even know that there are times where we have to stretch those limitations. But yeah, I think that's very helpful. Kind of following up on that a little bit, and how she was not afraid of hard work, and the hard work of ministry in particular. Even before she went to Ecuador with, she wasn't married when she went to Ecuador. Is that correct? She
That's
went
correct.
single. Yeah. But before she went there, and started working with Jim, who would eventually be her husband, and those other missionaries, she was a missionary. She did some mission work in rural Canada. And in the book, you talk about that kind of being a very difficult season in her life, of kind of being one of two missionaries, very young, to reach and minister to this wide area of Canada. Um, what can young people today learn from her example? Thinking about their own potential call to missions or ministry, or because I just think how brave she was to go and leave her home and go serve the Lord in a place that she doesn't know, she's not familiar with, she's miles from other people. What can we learn? What can young people today learn from her example?
Oh, that's a great question. So, in one sense, I think, and you talk about different size of plates. I think, in one sense, the um, rural mission work was maybe less daunting to her than it would have been to some people. She seems to have kind of enjoyed the long hikes and the adventure side of that in a way that I think not everybody not everybody would. There certainly were difficult aspects of it for her, and in the book you can see her kind of having to nerve herself up to take the job in rural Canada, um,
Yeah.
because she's really worried that she thinks she should do it, but she's really worried that she's not cut out for it because of having to have so much personal contact with strangers, which was a very difficult thing for her kind of all her life. Um, and so, and then when she's in the job, she's worrying about whether she's doing a good enough job. Um, and really, you can see those challenges crop up again repeatedly throughout her life. It wasn't just something that happened to her when she was young, but she had she had prayed for a long time and listened, to try to hear the voice of the Lord before she accepted the job. And so once she accepted it, she felt like she was called to it, and um, and she didn't see things being hard necessarily as a reason to stop doing what she was called to do. And that kind of gets back to that tension from your earlier question. It's a question of discernment at any given point, whether you're being called to set down something hard so that you don't wipe yourself out, or whether you're being called to stick to something hard because it needs to be done and you're the person to do it. So.
Yeah, I think that comes across a lot, especially in her early life. You talk about her like taking on different jobs in her college, but also like in her like high school. She went to a girls' high school. Is that correct? All girls Christian school.
It
Is that
it
correct?
was it was mixed. It was a co-ed school,
Okay.
but it was a boarding school, and so she was
Yeah.
away from home. Yeah. So
Yeah, and she had many duties like in the kitchen or in the dining
yes,
hall or whatever, and she overstretched herself there, and I think that was probably good preparation for the hard work of ministry that she would have later in life. Do you think that she was? I get the sense that she was very much a Type A personality. Do you get that same sense as well?
yeah, I think you could probably characterize her that way.
Yeah, because you're talking about how she doesn't. Not everybody likes to hike through the jungles and that sort of thing. I feel like that's probably more of a Type A personality, but that's where the Lord uses our personalities and those giftings, more not just spiritual giftings but more those physical giftings, because not everybody's cut out for that kind of work, and so I think that comes through as well. As we talked about earlier, and her mission work in Ecuador among the Waodani people, that's what most people know her for. Yet she only spent relatively a short part of her life there on the mission field in Ecuador. Where would you say she made the greatest impact in her ministry? It's probably hard to answer, but
Yeah, to my mind, I think that question is actually impossible to answer, not just about Elliot, but about anybody. Um, and I think that's because it during this life, I don't think we have enough of the picture to know what spiritual impacts are being made by which things we do. We can make a guess, but um, so we could say, well, Elliot saw her work on the mission field um, kind of as just a series of failures and losses, but look at the reach she was able to have as a writer and speaker, in the U.S. So that must be the greater influence, or the initial contact attempt with the Waorani failed, but now there are Waorani Christians, and that's a result greater than anything else that we could point to. Um, but on the other side of the coin, um, I think the math on human beings is always more complicated than that. And she helped a lot of people with her writing and her speaking, but she also hurt some people very badly. Um, and her medical work in Ecuador saved lives, but she also described in a piece she wrote for Eternity magazine in the '60s. She described a situation where she believed she had also caused a death that wouldn't have occurred if she hadn't been there. Um, and so when everybody's life is priceless and irreplaceable, I don't know how you balance all of that. And so I think it's going to take um, the Lord's return before we really know where any of us have made the greatest impact. So.
yeah, I think that's helpful, and I think it shows how um, as long as we are seeking to work under the Lord, um, her role as a mother was just as important as her role as a missionary and her
Yeah.
role as a writer and speaker, probably more important as a mother. And so we don't know that impact that any of us will have, like you just said, until eternity. You mentioned this in the book, and I think some people might already know this, but she not only lost her first husband, Jim, on the mission field, she also lost her second husband. I believe was it to cancer? Is that I
Yes.
can't remember. Okay.
Yep. Cancer.
Um, how do you think that these two tragedies made her the woman that she was later in life.
So when she was a teenager, there were, various things that happened where her response to kind of the suffering of the people that she saw around her came across as, and of course it's impossible to know what's really going on inside somebody's heart and mind, but kind of came across as this sort of glib, um, you know, God has a perfect plan, and just an assurance that everything is going to work out for the best. And even in the first few months after Jim died, she seems like she was kind of operating out of this kind of trying to live up to this framework, this ideal of the triumphal suffering Christian. But I think gradually over time, her own suffering, and I think this comes out really clearly in her writing around the death of her second husband, her own suffering helped to make her more tender to the suffering of other people. And she was able to share comfort out of her own grief in ways that she hadn't been able to when she was younger. So
evangelical, interdenominational, reformational. At Beeson Divinity School, these core values are the foundation on which we prepare students for a vocation in ministry. Based in Birmingham, Alabama, our graduate degree programs are offered in person and are strengthened by faculty mentoring, small class sizes, and a vibrant community. Take the next step in preparing for ministry at Beeson Divinity School.
Some of our listeners may not know that Elisabeth Elliot was also, in later life, a professor at Gordon Conwell Seminary, and she made a huge impact on the life of the late Timothy Keller and his wife, Kathy. How do you see her legacy living on in the lives of those she impacted as a professor? Not maybe just Tim and Kathy Keller, but others that she impacted as a professor.
yeah, I mean, the things that Keller's gleaned from her that changed them have certainly then gone on to a lot of other people through their influence. And she also taught the Reverend Viscountess Johnson, who, was then went on and touched a lot of other people's lives. I think, I mean, I'm sure different students took away different highlights from her teaching. I think she and Tim Keller really shared a love of stories, and the power of story to communicate truth, and help us kind of see reality in new ways or see it more clearly. And I know that the Reverend Johnson really appreciated her emphasis on um, conveying your principles or beliefs through your behavior, um, and kind of waiting patiently on God to work in difficult situations.
Yeah, I know she plays a prominent role in the new Tim Keller biography by Colin Hanson. I believe a whole chapter or a good part of a chapter is dedicated to her influence on Tim Keller, and I think that's helpful. How do you think that Elisabeth Elliot should be remembered in future generations?
That's another question that seems like it's really hard to boil it down to a small space. Flannery O'Connor said that you tell a story because a statement would be inadequate. And when anybody asks what a story is about, the only proper thing is to tell him to read the story. And that's a little bit how I feel about Elisabeth Elliot's life. It took 600 pages to say how I think she should be remembered.
That's true, yeah.
But the best stab I can take at a short answer is that I would love for her to be remembered as a regular person who had strengths and who had weaknesses, but who devoted her whole life to trying to know God, even at great personal cost. And that meant that she changed course over the years, and she didn't always get things right. but she was always trying to love Jesus and get to know him better.
Amen. I think that's what should be said about all of us who are trying to follow Jesus. And I hope that this book will point people to her life and her not just her influence, but her to learn from her and apply what she can teach us to our own Christian walk. What do you think that a young person considering work on the mission field or just in ministry in general can draw from the life of Elisabeth Elliot that would be most useful in that future work as a missionary or in ministry?
I think the first thing I would say is to go and read some of her books. So specifically, she's really well known for Through Gates of Splendor, but her perspective on the mission field changed so much after that book was published that I would recommend, her biography, but also her book, The Savage, My Kinsman, and These Strange Ashes, which are both autobiographical books about her time in the mission field. And especially her novel No Graven Image, which is kind of the piece de resistance, or her best attempt to say what she thought about her time in the mission field after she had moved back to the States and had some time to think about it. And then I would also really recommend Catherine T. Long's book, which came out in 2019, God in the Rainforest, which really helps to bring Elliot's story and the Wairani story kind of up to the present day. But aside from reading all of those, I think the two things that have really stood out to me as I've learned more about her missionary work are first that the more closely Elliot lived with the people who she had come to spend, to work with as a missionary, the more she was able to see the value and the strengths in their culture and the ways in which her own culture of origin was lacking or was flawed. And so she started seeing a lot more complexity, a lot more gray in the world and in her understanding of the Bible than she had as she was growing up. And she started to see herself not only as somebody who had things to share, but as somebody who had a lot to learn. And I think that posture, which I think is probably what the Bible calls humility, is really helpful in any line of work, but maybe especially in cross-cultural work. And then the other thing is that I've really been struck by Elliot's ability to change. After she had ordered her entire life around foreign missions, she had committed herself to Ecuador as her permanent home. She had lost her husband on the mission field, and all of her memories of their life together were bound up in the house and the furniture that he had built for them in Ecuador. She had kind of spent the prime of her life in missionary work. To decide that God was calling her to other things and to walk away from all of that is remarkable to me. I think it would have been really easy for her to double down and stay there. And when she wrote about it later in her journal, she called that leaving a death. But I suspect that she was able to do it because, however imperfectly, she managed to keep knowing God as her end goal rather than being a missionary as her end goal. Paul says in 1 Timothy that the goal of our instruction is love. And I think reorienting ourselves over and over again toward that end goal can be life-saving when things don't go the way that we plan for them to go. So.
I think that's helpful in all of our lives. I think we would all have a testimony of how we thought our life was going to go down one path, and then the Lord completely changes it. I know that's happened in my life, and still wrestling with those things in my own life. And I think when I was younger, I wish someone had have told me, be flexible. They probably did. Maybe I didn't listen. But be flexible to the Lord's call, because it can be subject to change. I think in my own life, I went into ministry thinking that it would never change, but it definitely has. And I think her life is a testimony to, like you said, being flexible, and how she was so dedicated to the mission field, not just in Canada, but then ultimately in Ecuador, and how she sacrificially served the Waodani people for those 2 years, bringing them the gospel and showing Christ's love, to then, and even raising her own daughter the first few years of her life in that setting, and then to just come to the conclusion that the Lord was leading her somewhere else. That also took as much bravery to encourage to walk away and to leave that work to other people than simply staying. I know the end of the Waodani story is yet to be written, but kind of, some of the rest of that story, I know, like some of the other missionary children, like Nate Saint, him and his family went back and lived there for a few decades in Ecuador, living among the Waodani people and teaching them and equipping them to continue the work that was started even with those first 5 missionaries. And so Elisabeth let those people do that work, and she went on to other things. So I think that's helpful to think that we're not ministry is important, and the Lord calls us for a reason, but Jesus is the Savior, not us. And so
Yeah.
I think that's very, very helpful. Kind of as we wrap up, I just have a couple more questions for you before we end our conversation today. How do you hope? So I know your book, it's a biography. It's specifically a Christian biography, written from a Christian perspective about a subject that is a Christian and published by a Christian publishing house. But how do you hope that someone who may be an unbeliever that might pick this up, how do you hope that your book will point unbelievers to the gospel?
That's another good question. I mean, I think for Elisabeth Elliot, the foundation in her life that held her up when everything seemed to have become meaningless and she was, really deeply suffering, was her faith in the reality of God, and not just there being a divine being out there somewhere, but the reality of God's character as a God who is first and foremost and fundamentally love. And at the later in her life, when she had her radio program, her tagline that she introduced every show with was, "You are loved with an everlasting love." That's what the Bible says. And underneath are the everlasting arms. And I think that confidence in who God is was kind of the underpinning of her life that enabled her to keep going. And if other people were able to meet that God who is love in reading the book, that would be good.
Amen. Kind of to couple that with another question, how do you hope that the book will remind believers of the hope of the gospel?
Oh, that's probably really the same answer. I mean, I think that's what we all need.
Yeah.
It's really easy, I think, for people who have always lived in a church environment to get sucked into being the older brother in the parable who are focused on doing the right things for God, and maybe lose track of the love of God for us. So I think that's what we all need to keep coming back to, is knowing that we're beloved.
There's her influence on Timothy Keller again in his book, The Prodigal God. So, I think those are helpful. As we end our conversation, I always like to ask our guests, specifically the guests that are authors, do you have any future book projects in the works?
So I am getting started on Crossway's doing a middle grade biography series, and I'm getting started on an Elizabeth Elliot biography for middle grade readers. So that's kind of my next project. So.
That's great. Look forward to that. Will that be kind of drawn from this book? Will it kind of be like not like necessarily a summary, but kind of, I don't know, the watered down is not the right word either, but some down version of this book, or are you just writing it totally from scratch?
Well, the research will be the same for both. I mean, I'm relying largely on my existing research, but a 15,000 word book is so different from a 250,000 word book that it's just going to kind of have to be its own animal from the beginning. So, yeah. So we'll see how it shapes up.
Yeah. Do you have a publication date for that set, or is that just in the works?
I know that they have an estimated one, but I don't remember what it is. I'm sorry. It's
okay.
My deadline is about a year from now, and then it'll come out after that. So.
Okay, so probably 2026 or late 2025.
Yeah, I would guess so.
Okay, good. Well, we will definitely look forward to that. And when that comes out, we'll have to have you back on the podcast to talk about that book. For our listeners who to the podcast who might not be as familiar with our work on readingfortheglory.com, you did a version of this conversation in print for us before we launched the podcast.
Yes.
And in that, you kind of ended that conversation that you said that you were, I know you're in a different place than you were then. You to this question, you said you were catching your breath and doing some other writings, but that you were working on tidying up the research from this book to donate to the Billy Graham Center at Wheaton College. Can you share more about that? And is there like an archives for Elizabeth Elliot studies, or how does that kind of look?
Yeah. So at the archives at the Billy Graham Center at Wheaton, they have files on everybody you've heard of in evangelicalism, and a lot of people you haven't probably.
Right.
And so some of my research materials, particularly, I did more than 24 interviews with her friends and family, and people who had been in her Bible studies and that kind of thing. And so I'm trying to edit all my transcripts and make sure the typos are out, and work on getting those things donated there so that they can be accessible to other researchers in the future. So,
yeah, that's great. So you were definitely paving the way for future Elizabeth Elliot studies. So
yeah,
I think that's very helpful. Dissertations and that sort of thing. So that's great. Well, thank you, Lucy, for joining us today. It was a pleasure to talk with you.
Thank you for having me on. I enjoyed our time.
Yeah, like I said, we'll have to have you back on when that new book comes out for younger readers on the same topic.
That would be great.
Yeah, would look forward to that. We would also like to thank you for listening and joining us today on this conversation on the Reading for the Glory podcast. We will be sure to have a link to Lucy's book, Elizabeth Elliot, A Life, in today's show notes. And don't forget that you can receive 30% off by being a Crossway Plus member. So we hope that you will check that out. If you have a question or comment, or simply would like to drop us a note, be sure to connect with us on social media. We're on Facebook, Threads, X, and Instagram. Be sure to follow us to stay up to date on our latest articles, book reviews, and podcast episodes. If you'd like to contact us by email, you can write to us at readingfortheglory.com/contact. We'd encourage you to subscribe and leave us a review wherever you are listening to this podcast. That'll help us out tremendously. We look forward to having you join us again next time on the Reading for the Glory podcast as we think biblically about books. Thank you for listening to the Reading for the Glory podcast. If you enjoyed today's content, we would like to invite you to consider becoming one of our ministry partners. Our ministry partners help to support the ongoing ministry of Reading for the Glory, which allows us to produce content such as our book reviews, our study series, and this podcast. For more information, please visit readingfortheglory.com/partners. And thank you for your support.